My name is Lionel Draper, and before the year of 1960 ended, I had already seen something in this park that no ranger should ever witness. And for decades I have tried to set it aside, bury it, the way the earth itself buried whatever rose beneath me that morning. But the memory keeps coming back to me, especially now that my hands shake, when I handle the old logbooks that still smell of pine sap and vintage ink, and I can feel the weight of everything I refuse to speak aloud. I was stationed in a forgotten corner of the park, a sector no tourist ever cared to see, and frankly one we were encouraged, not to mention officially. The paperwork simply listed it as Outer Perimeter Block C, but the older rangers called it the Quiet Zone, and they did not mean peaceful, they meant something else, something layered under silence like a second skin stretched over the land. That morning I took the old department truck out along the ridge road, the tires hissing against damp gravel, the analog radio crackling with static, because the tower had been having trouble for weeks, and we kept meaning to fix it, but something always got in the way. The sun was low, and the map on the passenger seat curled on its edges, as if trying to fold itself shut, as if it wanted to avoid the place I was heading toward. I remember rounding the bend, where the old logging road diverged, a scar left over from men who had taken too much from the forest, and I remember how the soil looked strangely smooth, almost glazed, as if a thin film of water rested atop it. There was no breeze, no motion, yet the ground rippled in a faint undulation like the surface of a pond, struck by a single drop of rain. I stopped the truck because that was not possible, and every instinct in me knew it. When you work alone out there year after year, you learn the language of the land, you learn what is normal and what is wrong. This was wrong in a quiet, deliberate way, the earth shifting not randomly, but in slow waves, each crest rising in a strangely timed rhythm. I stepped out of the truck, my boots sinking a little, but not into mud, more like into something that hesitated before supporting my weight. The ground felt elastic beneath me, and I froze, every muscle braced, listening. The forest around me held its breath, and even the birds had gone still, as if waiting for something to finish unfolding. I crouched and pressed my hand against the soil. It felt warm, warmer than it should have been at that hour, and the ripples pulsed outward from my touch, as though the ground reacted to me. I jerked my hand back, but the motion seemed to trigger something deeper. A long, slow swell rose beneath my boots, lifting me half an inch, then settling again, as if something enormous shifted far below. I forced myself to breathe, grabbed my flashlight, and swept the beam across the clearing. The vintage bulb flickered at first, before steadying its circle of light, moving across tree roots, fallen branches, and the eerily smooth earth that continued its rippling pattern from one side of the clearing to the other, like the land was inhaling and exhaling beneath a thin membrane of soil. I knew I should have reported immediately, but the radio had been glitching, and I doubted anything would come through. Besides, I had no language to describe what I was seeing. No handbook line or training lecture prepared us for a living ground. The logbook on my dashboard waited for my account, but even then I suspected that what I wrote might one day end my career. I turned back to the truck, planning to take soil samples, something simple, tangible, and rational. But the moment my weight shifted, the ground surged again, this time far stronger, a rolling bulge pushing upward under the left front tire of the truck. The entire chassis rocked with a groaning sound that came not from the engine, but from the shifting earth itself. A cold sensation spread across my back like invisible fingertips, tracing my spine. The wave passed beneath the truck, then beneath me, the soil lifting and lowering with the smoothness of a creature adjusting its posture. And for the first time I wondered if I was standing on something alive, not metaphorically alive, but truly breathing beneath its own camouflage of forest floor. I wanted to run, I truly did, but rangers are taught to face danger, evaluate it, document it, and I forced myself to stand firm, knees shaking, watching. As the earth settled into stillness again, ripples fading like the last vibrations of a struck drum's skin, I waited for the next swell. And none came. An absence that felt just as terrifying as the motion, because it meant that whatever it was had become aware of me, aware enough to go still. I walked backwards slowly, flashlight fixed on the clearing, afraid that turning my back would provoke another movement. Every leaf seemed sharper, every shadow deeper, as if the forest itself leaned closer, listening. I reached the truck door, then stopped as another realization hit me. The smooth section of earth was wider than before, enlarged, as if the rippling had stretched its boundaries while I stood there. I did not know it then, but this was only the beginning, the first whisper of something that had been buried longer than any of us understood, something that did not want to remain buried. I drove away from that clearing more slowly than I ever had on patrol, not wanting to disturb whatever rested beneath the soil. The truck rattled along the old logging road, and each vibration made me think of the ripples, the strange warmth, the way the earth had lifted me as gently as a breath. I kept glancing at the analog radio, hoping for a voice, any voice. But it only hissed with static, a thin, restless whisper, that made the cab feel smaller than it was. Back at the outpost, a squat wooden building with peeling paint and a tin roof, I reached for my logbook. The familiar weight of paper steadied my hands, but only barely. I stared at the blank page, feeling the pencil hover above it, uncertain of where to begin. How do you describe a living landscape? How do you explain to anyone that the earth moved under you in a way that felt purposeful, aware, not a quake, not settling soil, but something that chose its rhythm with unsettling precision? I wrote only the facts at first, because facts felt like a tether, rippling ground temperature, elevated soil movement, inconsistent with natural patterns, truck displacement, minor, no injury, further assessment required. But as I wrote those words, my pulse picked up because the truth behind them pressed at my ribs like a trapped secret wanting out. Something rose today. I wanted to write that something rose and saw me, but I did not, because even my private log felt too official, too risky. I tried calling headquarters again. The radio sputtered, crackled, then let out a long, low tone that almost sounded like a faint moan drifting through the static. I shut it off immediately, afraid of hearing more, afraid of recognizing something in the sound. I had never known fear like that, not during storms, not during rescues, not even when we lost a ranger 2 years back near the basin, where the land sank into a natural bowl of unmapped terrain. I stepped outside, needing air. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the outpost yard, but something felt wrong in their shape, as if they bent slightly with an unseen pull. I scanned the ridge line and saw nothing, yet the silence out there felt heavier than usual, saturated with expectation. The forest waited. I could feel it, the way you feel a shift in the wind before a storm, except the air remained still, untouched. I knew then that I had to go back, not because I wanted to, but because I could not leave that clearing unexamined. Dread, or not duty, or not. I grabbed my flashlight and map and slid into the truck again. The old engine growled awake, and I followed the road back toward the quiet zone, though a voice in my head urged me to turn away, ignore it, forget what I saw. But that voice sounded far too much like fear for me to listen. The sun had dipped behind the ridge when I reached the clearing again, shadows pooling around tree trunks like dark water. I stepped out slowly, testing the soil. The rippling had stopped, but the ground looked subtly altered, as though the surface had stretched and smoothed itself. While I was gone, attention filled the air, a tautness that reminded me of a drum's skin pulled tight across a hollow frame. I crouched and pressed my hand to the soil, half expecting a reaction. Nothing happened at first, no warmth, no shift. But then a faint quiver passed beneath my palm, not a ripple this time, but something like a pulse, slow and steady, unmistakably organic. I jerked back, stumbling up to my feet, heart hammering in my ears. Something was beneath me, something vast and patient. I swept my flashlight across the clearing again, and the beam caught a subtle depression near the center, a place where the soil dipped inward in a shallow bowl, far too symmetrical to be natural. It looked almost like an impression or a resting place, and the edges of it bore faint lines that might have been cracks, or might have been something like the grooves of a giant fingerprint. I felt watched, not from the trees, but from below. The sensation seeped upward through my boots, traveling along my bones like cold water. I backed toward the truck, but stopped as the soil shifted again, just once, a small motion, a suggestion rather than an act. The ground exhaled beneath me, a long, soft release of pressure, like something settling deeper after rising too close to the surface. I whispered, though whispers hardly mattered without punctuation. There was no shape to the words, only breath and fear. I whispered anyway, because silence felt disrespectful, as if I were standing on something sacred or dangerous, or both. I told the ground I was leaving, and that I meant no harm, and the moment the words left me, another faint tremor passed beneath my feet, a response, maybe an acknowledgement or a warning. I left the clearing in near darkness, the vintage flashlight flickering with each step, as if he thing beneath the soil interfered with its filament. The trees watched silently, their branches unmoving even though the night breeze had finally arrived. I did not look back, because something in me knew that if I did, I might see the ground rise again, and this time not stop. I reached the outpost long after nightfall, my breath shaking in my chest. I wrote another brief entry in the logbook, though the pencil slipped in my grasp. Soil movement continues, biological characteristics suspected, requires further analysis, probable hazard, avoid until sunrise. But I knew I would not avoid it, not because of duty anymore, but because some part of me needed to understand what shared the land with us, what breathed beneath our feet, and why it had chosen to rise for me. I barely slept that night. Each creak of the cabin floor, each rustle of branches outside, felt like another tremor, another pulse, traveling upward through the world. And by dawn, I knew something had changed in the forest, not visibly, but fundamentally, as if the thing below had begun listening to every movement, every footstep, every heartbeat on the surface. And I knew it was waiting. Morning came, pale and thin, the kind of washed-out light that makes the world look unfinished, and when I stepped outside the outpost, the forest felt hollow, As if something had scooped the sound out of it, I listened for birds, but none called, listened for branches, but none swayed. The quiet pressed against me like a hand over my mouth. And I understood then that the thing beneath the ground had not simply noticed me, it was focusing on me. I drove toward the basin because the clearing alone no longer felt like the heart of what I had witnessed. The basin was deeper, older, a wide natural depression. The park never mapped officially, because compasses spun uselessly there, and radios failed. I had been warned not to patrol it alone. And yet I found myself heading straight for it, the wheels of the truck crunching over pine needles, as if I were trespassing in a place kept hidden even from those sworn to protect it. When I reached the basin, the air felt heavier, as though I had stepped beneath an invisible ceiling. My flashlight, even unlit, flickered at the edges, its filament trembling without power. I left it in the truck and walked down into the hollow, my boots moving across soil that seemed far too smooth, as though the land had been ironed flat by a giant hand. I could feel warmth under the surface, faint but steady, almost like breath leaking upward. Halfway across the basin, the ground responded to my weight. A long, slow ripple traveled outward from each step, not fast enough to be alarming, but deliberate enough to feel aware. It reminded me of walking on a thick waterbed, except nothing shifted freely, everything moved in controlled, measured waves. I knelt and placed a hand on the soil, and a pulse rose to meet it, not a tremor, a pulse, a living rhythm far deeper than any heartbeat. I whispered again, without punctuation, without structure, just breath shaped into meaning, telling the thing beneath me that I knew it was there, telling it I had seen the clearing, felt the rise and fall, telling it I was not its enemy. And the moment the words reached the air, the ground pushed upward, rising in a wide, slow swell, as if something massive stretched beneath a thin blanket of soil. The swell traveled across the basin, lifting the earth in a rolling wave 20, maybe 30 feet across my boots, left the surface for a heartbeat, suspended on a moving landscape, before gravity reclaimed me and I staggered backward. The wave continued toward the far tree line, climbing the slope, before sinking once more into stillness, leaving behind a shallow furrow like a memory of motion. Something rose that day in full, something vast and old and patient, and I was the only witness. I turned to flee, but froze when unmarked vehicles rolled silently onto the ridge above the basin, black shapes against the pale morning light. Men stepped out wearing uniforms, without insignias, their movements crisp, purposeful, practiced. One raised a hand, signaling me to remain where I was, though I had not moved at all. They approached in coordinated formation, boots heavy on the ground, though none of them seemed to notice or care about the subtle ripples beneath their steps, as if they already knew the nature of the thing resting below the soil, and had long accepted its presence. One of them carried a metal case, another held a folder thick with documents, maps, photographs, and more pages than anyone should have about a place that supposedly held nothing. The lead man stopped in front of me, his expression blank as old stone, his voice without emotion. He asked what I had seen, and I told him only the simplest version: soil movement, unexplained phenomena, possible seismic anomaly. He studied me as if he could hear the lies inside my truth. Then he opened the folder, revealing a page stamped with a classification level I had never seen. Usually, we used simple codes, nothing like the stark, heavy let ring that glared up from that page. He told me to sign a non-disclosure form. He told me the basin was part of a geological survey. He told me my report would be rewritten to reflect an equipment malfunction. He told me I would speak of this to no one under any circumstance. I asked him what lay beneath the basin, but he closed the folder before I finished the question, and the silence that followed was colder than the morning air. They escorted me back to my truck, one man placing a hand on my shoulder with a pressure that was not threatening but final, as if sealing a door behind me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them setting equipment, forming a perimeter, planting instruments into the warm, rippling soil. The land reacted faintly to their presence, a low undulation, almost hesitant, like a creature recognizing old handlers. For decades I carried that silence like a second skin, pretending the memory did not move inside me like a buried pulse. But secrets have weight, and I have grown too old to bear it any longer. The logbooks sit beside me now, their pages brittle, their pencil marks fading, but the truth remains etched in me deeper than any ink. The ground in that basin was alive and aware, and that morning in 1960 it rose to meet me, not in anger, not in malice, but in recognition. Something beneath the park heard my footsteps and listened. It listened then, and I believe it listened still, waiting beneath the surface of a land millions walk upon, never knowing what lies just below a thin, trembling veil of soul. And now, at the end of my life, I offer this confession, not for absolution, but for truth, because the world deserves to know that the earth is not always solid beneath our feet, and some places were never meant to be mapped or managed or forgotten. Some things only sleep,